In the last lesson, we created a brand new cluster on MongoDB Atlas, and we've successfully managed to get our Node.js app to talk to this cluster and be able to save data and communicate with our to-do list DB. Now, in this lesson, we're going to deploy our Node.js app into Heroku so that we can access our website from anywhere across the internet and not just through localhost 3000 on our local system. We're going to do this using our old friend Heroku, and you should have already signed up to Heroku because previously we already deployed our newsletter app. So just go ahead and log in. And you should now be looking at your personal dashboard. There's a couple of steps that are required before we can deploy an app to Heroku. And it's a good idea to head over to the documentation to remind yourself of what those steps are. So just click on node.js and click on Get Started with Node.js, and then click on I'm ready to start, and then scroll down to the part where it says I have already installed the Heroku CLI. Now, if you haven't looked at the module where we've deployed our newsletter app to Heroku, then I recommend heading over back there because there's a couple of setup instructions that you have to do the first time that you deploy an app to Heroku. But presuming that you've already done those things with me the last time we deployed Heroku, we're just going to plow along and power through. The first thing to do is we need to prepare our app. And for a short list of things we need to do if we have an existing application that we want to deploy, we're just going to click on this link, and it takes us to this particular article, which I'll link to in the course resources of this lesson as well. Now, the first step is to track your code base in a Git repository. Let's head over to our terminal. And we're going to Control-C to exit our previous NodeMon instance, and just check to make sure that you're still in the location of your project folder. And we're going to type in git init to initialize an empty Git repository. And then we're going to say git add space dot. And this will add everything that we currently have in our repository to the staging area. And we're ready to commit our app. And I'm just going to call it initial commit. The next thing that it's asking us to do is to add a Heroku Git remote. And to do this, the first thing we have to do is to log in to Heroku. So you already should have the Heroku command line interface installed from the last time when we deployed to Heroku. So you should be able to say Heroku login. And now it will ask you for your email and your password to log in to Heroku. And once that's successful, you'll see something in green and it'll tell you that you are logged in. Now that you're logged in, feel free to just type clear to clear your screen, and we're ready to head over to the next step. And the next step is to add a Heroku Git remote. So here we have to say Heroku create, and that will create our brand new app on Heroku, which is now called Gentle Stream. Sounds very relaxing. And we're ready to move on to the next step, which is adding a proc file. Inside our current project container folder, we're going to write touch, and then we're going to write proc file without an extension. So the easiest way is simply just to copy this, because if you have any typos, it's a massive headache down the line, and just to paste it in here. So now we're creating a file called proc, P-R-O-C file with no extensions, no .text, no .anything, and we're going to hit enter. And this step is super important because later on you'll have problems with Heroku and it will be down to something like this. So next we're going to open up this proc file using the application that is Atom. If you don't add in Atom, it usually defaults to text edit, which will work just as fine, but sometimes when you write these quotation marks, it has a stylized version, which leads to problems as well. So in our proc file, Heroku instructs us to put in something like this, which tells it that it's a web application, and to start it, the entry point is at app.js. So for us, it's pretty simple. We're just going to copy it as is and paste it in here, and then hit save. That's step 3 done. And then we can move on to step 4, which is listening on the right port. Heroku is going to generate a dynamic port rather than use the static one, which we've set as port 3000. You can either set your app to simply only listen on their port, which is process.env.port. It's basically just a variable that they get to set. Or if you want to be able to run it locally as well as having it run on Heroku, then you can use something like this. So just above our app.listen, I'm going to paste those lines of code. I'm going to change their default port to our preference, which is 3000. And this basically says that let port equal the port that Heroku has set up. If they haven't set one up, when port is null or port is an empty string, then we're going to use our local one. So now we're going to say, instead of app.listen port, we're going to say app.listen port, have a callback function that says console log that says server has started successfully. All right, so that's step 4 done. Next is step 5, which we have already completed. It's telling us instead of writing your database to your local file system, so our local host 27017 MongoDB, instead use a database. For example, Amazon S3, Heroku Postgres, or in our case, it's MongoDB on mongodb.net. And this is, of course, using our MongoDB Atlas. Now we can skip ahead to step 6, which is completing the language-specific setup. So we'll click on node.js, and the only thing that we have to do here is to add the version of Node to our package.json. So I'm just going to copy this, and we're going to head over to our Atom, where we've got our package.json, and right below where it says license, I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to paste my engines key in here. And then I'm going to hit save. Now, this version of Node is not the version of Node that we've been using. It's way, way older. So to find out the version of Node that you're currently running, we're just going to type into the command line node -- version and hit enter. And you can see that I'm currently working with 8.12.0. So to figure out which Node version you're running, simply in the command line, just type node -- version, and you will get the one that you've been running locally and it's been working successfully for you. So just go ahead and copy that number into where it says node. And here we're going to put it inside the quotation marks and hit save. And we're now done with that step. Now we're pretty much ready. The last thing it wants us to do is to create a git ignore file that ignores our node modules or DS store or the debug log. And this is something that we learned about when we learned about GitHub in the Git and GitHub module. It's quite a good idea to do because at the moment we have this giant folder called node modules, and it's got all of our dependencies in there. And what Heroku will do is, instead of trying to upload all of this code, it will look inside your dependencies and rebuild it using npm install on their server. By adding a git ignore, we will get to ignore all of these node modules and get Heroku to rebuild these on their end, making it easier to work with your app. So let's go ahead into our terminal and let's just create a .git ignore file. And then we're going to open this .git ignore file, and we're going to open it inside Atom yet again. And then we're just going to copy and paste all of these into here, hit save, and now we get to ignore the node modules folder, the npm debug log, and the .ds store, for example, like this file. That is only there because I've created this folder on a Mac and it wants to know how I want my icons laid out. So all of these things can go in the git ignore, and we can hit save and close. And now we are pretty much ready to deploy our application to Heroku. So let's go ahead and again say git add space dot and git commit. And I'm just going to call it add git ignore proc file and update ports. Okay, now let's hit enter and let's commit all of our changes. And now, because we've already created our Heroku remote, we can simply skip to the next step and say git push Heroku master. And now it's going to do a whole bunch of things behind the scenes, uploading things, compressing objects, building it, running npm install on their side. And once it's done, it will say build succeeded, and it'll tell you that it's now launched and released it to this URL, gentlestream something something.herokuapp.com. So now if we go ahead and click on it, then you can see we have our to-do list app now being deployed from Heroku using HTTPS via the internet, and the backend is connected to our MongoDB cluster in Atlas, because that previous test item came the last time we tried to test it locally. So let's now go ahead and test this. Let's see if we can create a new item. Let's just call it, I don't know, what task do I have to do? I don't know, feed me. So let's add that to our to-do list and let's check in our Atlas. And if we simply hit refresh to see what new data has come through, then right at the bottom, you can see that item being saved in our cluster. So now at this point, you can share this URL with anybody on Twitter, on Facebook, share it in the Q&A section so that everybody can get to see, and share it with your friends and family and show off what you've created, because anybody will be able to access it and add to-do list items or add new to-do lists, etc. We've now got a complete website with a Node backend and a MongoDB database that's hosted live on the internet. Well done for everybody who's followed along this far, and enjoy playing around with your live website.